secretary said he's out playing squash. And I was horrified. I said, well, I'll keep his secret. I won't tell anybody. And so when he came back and I said, Wally, I heard you're out playing squash and you could be fired and I won't tell anybody. He said, listen, you have to take care of you. Otherwise you can't take care of people. And so actually, thanks to him, I play squash every Wednesday. I'm David Henry. I'm a clinical professor of medicine at Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia, where I practice hematology and oncology.
Welcome to the 16th episode of the MDedge Post Call podcast. I'm Nick Andrews, your host. In this edition, we talk to Dr. David Henry, the host of the MDedge Blood and Cancer podcast, which just launched wherever podcasts are found. Blood and Cancer is all about hematology and oncology. The show centers around bringing real research with practical use to the clinic for listeners. Dr. Henry and I talk about ways that he blows off stress, why he podcasts, what podcasting can do, and generalities about the field of oncology and hematology. You can find a link to Blood and Cancer episode 1 in the podcast notes. And now, my conversation with Dr. David Henry. So the conversation today is going to be all about the podcast that you are, I guess the appropriate term is relaunching. So talk to me about how important it is to get these audio interviews out there for the world of hematology oncology. The podcast is Blood and Cancer. The first episode was available on January 31st, and it's really exciting. It's a good time to be in hematology and oncology.
Yeah, indeed it is. So we're very excited about this. So I'm a practicing hematologist oncologist, and I'm a consumer much more than I am a giver, but I'm doing a little of each now, recording these podcasts called Blood and Cancer, and our first one is going to cover things like biosimilars with Gary Lyman or nausea and vomiting with Richard Gralla. And I'm always asking myself and those I practice with, how do you stay current? I haven't bought a textbook in, I can't remember, 10, 15 years because they're out of date right away. And so I get my updates and information from going to meetings, but not everybody can or does. And so I'm finding podcasts or recorded discs or lectures are really the way to go. So to continue that theme, we thought with our journal at MDedge Oncology Hematology, we would launch this podcast called Blood and Cancer and do it on a regular basis, offering thought leader interviews on various important topics to the practicing hematologist oncologist.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the really great motivating things to me being in this line of work that audio has such an opportunity to make a genuine impact, because although all of us would like to stay read on current events and different aspects of our careers, you can't read without taking time and having the cognitive ability to read the words. But with audio, you can pick up nuggets and pearls here or there while you're doing other things like commuting or working out or maybe taking care of some things in the office. So I think there's a great opportunity to further the education of some of these things. But now, what's your specific motivation? Is this something that you've always wanted to do, or do you like having these conversations?
Yeah, I agree completely. And, again, being a consumer and what works for me, and I'm hoping this will work for those listening to us on Blood and Cancer. I have a commute of some 45 minutes in the car. Once I get the news and who's done what, then I'm anxious to get a little update or information or knowledge from my practice that day. On the way home, I tend to use the phone to call patients. I don't know how I practice before the cell phone. So using this podcast, we have the time on the train, on the exercise bike, jogging, or simply commuting where maybe you don't want to read something you can't read while you're driving. And it's a little hard to read while you're doing things like exercise bike or jogging. So it takes advantage, just as you said, of this time when audio would work. In fact, it's a nice diversion whatever you might be doing. My commute is made ever so much nicer by learning something interesting or getting a current update from a thought leader on a particular topic of interest to me. And of course, I'm hematology oncology, but I think this is more and more as I talk to young trainees and those who are mid-career or late career, whatever their specialty, they like hearing what others think about it and getting new information about it as well.
Yeah, I think that's and that's really enjoyable to me. I've been, a connoisseur of sorts for a couple of years, and what I find is that it gives us the opportunity to listen to these things unedited, which is really tough. We live in a soundbite culture. There are tweets and Instagram posts, and things are digestible quickly. But in the first episode, you talked about biosimilars for nausea and vomiting, and you really get into the nitty gritty with a little bit of history on how the biosimilars have progressed, what it means for a patient to go through things like this. You get into questions at the very end about what if patients ask about marijuana, and those things strung together, unedited, are possibly, arguably, as good as a lecture because it's between two colleagues.
Agree, and I think we've also tried to introduce a little audience warm-up. I've listened to some other podcasts where they do this, and so the interviewer will ask the interviewee, where do you practice? What do you do? What's your current favorite book? What's your current favorite movie? You know, make it relevant to all of us have things we do besides medicine, or hopefully. Yeah. Otherwise, we're going to burn out sooner than later. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to be doing that as well and get some interesting answers. What was your worst moment, your best moment? How do you train young trainees? How did they train you? And then dive into the topic of the day.
Yeah, and I love that. That's sort of what this podcast is about, the post-call conversations, the conversations that dip in and out of practice and medicine, but also maybe might dabble into what TV shows. For example, we're recording this as the polar vortex has just dominated the Midwest, and so those kind of conversations can show who your guest is as a person and what they like to do. And I guess on that note, what's going on in your life? Do you have any movies or books or anything that's particularly exciting to you outside of your career?
Well, I always like to mention a book I read last summer that a student who rotated with us from Europe said, thanks so much, Dr. Henry, and here's a book I thought you might like. And I said, oh, that's very nice. And the book's entitled Bellevue.
Oh, yeah, Bellevue, yes.
History of those who haven't read it, and, if you're Midwest or West Coast, Bellevue is in New York. And it is arguably possibly one of the oldest medical care institutions in the country, which scared me and people at Penn, because we think Pennsylvania Hospital, where I am, Ben Franklin, 1751, is the oldest. In fact, the operators answer the phone, welcome to Pennsylvania Hospital, the nation's first. I was very afraid of that, to change that to the nation's second. So I invited actually him down. His book reads like a novel, going milestones of medicine as seen through the eyes of doctors practicing in the currently still operating indigent care, turns nobody away hospital in New York called Bellevue. And actually, they're not the oldest hospitals. He was careful to point out the place is older, goes back to like 1730, and had one or two beds next to it, this almshouse, where sick people, mostly psychiatric, could be cared for in the early days of the colonies. And then only became a hospital, I think it's like 1760 or thereabouts. But the reason I recommend the book is they discovered and implemented the first ambulance service. They started forensic medicine. They said maybe surgeons would like to have nurses in the OR, which was a novel idea. And surgeons thought it just kind of interfere with things, and then realized, of course, it's a great help. And so a lot of these trailblazing things, right on up to the AIDS epidemic and Superstorm Sandy, and what happens when a hospital shuts down, make this read like a novel. So that's my book review recommendation. In oncology, I do sadness all too often. Yeah. And so whenever my wife and I or the family go out to see a movie, if it's a heavy movie, I'll say, well, I'll be next door at a Clint Eastwood movie, or maybe Star Trek or Star Wars, something light and easy and not heavy, because when you do it every day, it's nice to get away from it. Here on the East Coast, we have the Jersey Shore, so love to go there weekends during the summer. And for non-medical time, little piano, tennis, and squash. I remember way back when I was training and we ate and slept nothing but medicine. One of the radiology attendings was not available one day on a Wednesday at noon when I went to look at some x-rays. And his secretary said he's out playing squash. And I was horrified. I said, well, I'll keep his secret. I won't tell anybody. And so when he came back and I said, Wally, I heard you're out playing squash and you could be fired and I won't tell anybody. He said, listen, you have to take care of you. Otherwise you can't take care of people. And so actually, thanks to him, I play squash every Wednesday. And I think that exercise, of course, as our youngsters know in training now, and we didn't know back in the day, is very important as well.
Yeah, I imagine that having ways to both alleviate stress and kind of forget yourself. That's one thing I do love about, although the the experience of going to movies has become burdensome. I don't like that I can't pause it or that the only snacks available to me are just diabetes. But I do like the idea that you're immersed in something. You have to shut your brain off and you have to engage with this thing that's being thrown at you. And you have to imagine that that's a pretty enjoyable way to blow off some steam. But squash, I have never played squash. And I grew up in the Rocky Mountain West, and there weren't a lot of opportunities for sports like that. But that sounds pretty fun.
Yeah, squash and tennis, and some sport. I take a piano lesson every now and then. My children who are grown, one's a young GI doctor, and the other's a first grade teacher, say, "Why haven't you learned it yet? Why are you taking a piano lesson?" Well, of course, it stimulates you to do a little something outside the box, use the other side of your brain, and you completely forget about medicine and sick patients for a short time.
Yeah, I've something that I've noticed since we started this podcast as a way to sort of engage about burnout and workload. And one thing that I've noticed just from the very surface, like a hypothesis level observation, has been the people who are overscheduled, but whose schedules can consistently contain non-medicine things. Those people do seem to me to generally be not burn out. That the energy keeps them going. And I obviously know you need your sleep and you need your health, but scheduling yourself a piano lesson and scheduling yourself an activity, it keeps your schedule jam packed, but also it keeps you energized in different ways, like a very well balanced way. So I'm wondering, do you advise this same thing to students and residents and fellows that you work with?
I do, and I also asked, and that makes me think also of the web. And of course, we're on it with our electronic medical records. We're on it all the time. In fact, if I don't know a fact or want to check something that sounds a little strange, the patient says, I'll Google it. I had a bizarre occurrence around Christmas. A woman who said, came in with her daughter, and daughter said, you have to help my mother. We're here for a colorectal follow-up. She's no active tumor recurrence, and that was good, but she is hearing Christmas carols in her head. Huh. And in fact, she called her next door neighbor in the condominium where she lives and said, turn down the radio. And the woman said, the radio's not on. And she said, well, I'm being terribly bothered by Christmas carols in my head. And the daughter then said, she's going deaf. And so I sat there and Googled this symptom complex. And sure enough, there is actually a legitimate syndrome. When you're going deaf, the brain somehow decides that it'll distract you, and it'll either talk to you, you'll hear kind of talking, you're not psychotic, or you might hear music, and that's what happened to her. So that's my way of saying the web is an incredibly useful tool. And I've said to some publishers and drug companies that the best web page that nobody's yet designed would be one that you could go to for medicine and would have a few open icon buttons where you could pop in ESPN or the news of the day or the stock market or Nordstrom's, or a couple of things that might interest you besides medicine. So while you're on that page, you can get what you need, but you might be able to look at, if you're following March Madness, you can see a score. So something on these web pages, again, to keep your mind engaged and not just drag you down all the time with medicine.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So I go out with some residents in my social life in Philadelphia, and what I've noticed is that the conversation, the way that you just described, it can go quickly from one thing to another, where they start discussing the recent events of a patient that they were seeing, and then bam, we're talking about the Super Bowl and the economic situation in the country. So it makes a lot of sense where you think, like, I don't need in-depth analysis from ESPN, but I would like to know what time the Sixers play tonight and how the stock.
Correct. We're on web pages. So briefly, we struggle with our journal, the new MDedge Oncology journal, and there are others like us that how to keep those who land on our page, keep them there, keep them engaged. And so if your page is confusing or poorly organized, people will move off right away. So again, how do we learn? Textbooks are going to be collector's items, and listening to podcasts, listening to lectures, going to meetings. Although now I'm speaking as my hematology oncologist hat, I go to our two major meetings each year out of habit and networking and clinical research, but I've watched it become less and less useful for the general practitioner. We think somewhere between 70–80% of hemonc is practiced at a non-university campus, and those doctors need useful practical information. Used to go to ASCO, the oncology meeting, or ASH, the hematology meeting, You'd come away knowing what's new and how to put it into practice. Now it's so highly specialized. It's 3-4 days of brand new, cutting edge, very narrow, specific information, and then you get it back on the plane and go, well, now what am I going to do when I get home? And so I think these sorts of things, podcast interviews with thought leaders, web pages that distill, summarize, comment, review, are ever so more useful.
Yeah, it's almost like it builds some sort of community that replaces the meeting. I went to ASCO in 2016, and that was when I think it was pembrolizumab was really like all the keynote trials were really like starting to spit out some data, and there was a lot of excitement. But I thought if you were coming to this meeting, it possibly would be most interesting for like investors and pharma developers, but not for if you were not at the University of Pennsylvania or Stanford or Harvard. This might be just sort of like an overwhelming party.
Yeah, it was right. 2016 ASCO was a party of the IO. In fact, I thought their slides kept having the number 10 until I realized IO meant immuno-oncology. It took even me a minute to figure it out. And it was a party about this new antibody and what it could do, antibodies, and it was wonderful and fascinating, but almost none of it was available unless you're on a clinical trial. So I think these meetings serve a major purpose, coming out party for all the newest, latest stuff. It's very stimulating, but it's less and less practical informing, which I think the major societies, ASH and ASCO, are very aware. I went to an ASH update just last weekend in New York and highlights of ASH, and there's going to be one after ASCO. They are really useful. These thought leaders come and they say, out of the 5,000 abstracts you just saw at ASH, here are the 10 in leukemia you need to know. Bang, 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 bang. They show them, you get to question them, and you take your notes, and now I know what to do when I go home. So I think this distillation, you got to go to that. So that's hard. Mm-hmm. Again, if this were done in podcast format, which I think they will do, and things like what we're doing may help do that, will be more useful.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I also think it gives, because it's on demand, right? You don't have to take 5 days out of your vacation to fly to Chicago or New Orleans or wherever you're going that year. You can say, like, I've got 45 minutes at night while I cook dinner, and you can kill two birds with one stone, as we mentioned before. It also, what I've noticed with some really popular podcasts online that have been around for a couple of years, it creates a sense of community where you can communicate with other people who listen to the show, and they talk about the show, and it branches off into other more practical things. For the first episode of Blood and Cancer, I thought that the information is arguably, I don't know, but it seems like it would be some of the most practical information for clinical oncologists on a day in and day out basis in dealing with patients with nausea.
Well, I'm very selfish because I'm the one doing them, and I get way more out of it than I give. Interviewing Gary Lyman about biosimilars, the worst thing about biosimilars is the name. So when I had this discussion with a patient today who was on the biosimilar for filgrastim, GCSF, and she said, I'd rather get brand. I said, well, when you hear biosimilar, what's that mean to you? Well, similar, not the same. And then we explained how that's the name, but these are identical in every way: safety and efficacy, toxicity, very rigid controls through the FDA. It's just because they're not brand that they got this name biosimilar. In fact, the brands, in this case, would be Neupogen and the biosimilar Xarixo. The brand is biosimilar of itself because they're made in nature's factory and they can never be identical. So that was fascinating to learn from Gary Lyman. And then Richard Gralla, who's a major thought leader, nausea and vomiting. When I first started practicing, people were terribly sick, and we had to admit them and knock them out to get them to take this therapy. And now it's an outpatient. He had some wonderful tricks to do an oral regimen to save chair time with something called NEPA, which is a combination pill now available, and things to send the patient home with for breakthrough nausea and vomiting. Very practical information that we gleaned from him.
Yeah, I enjoyed, as I put it together, I produce the interviews for people who don't know. So I listen to these things happen. I'm always tickled when I hear you with the genuine response of, wow, that is really, when you tell them, this is really interesting. I'm so glad you told me that. I had no idea.
Yeah, quite true.
Yeah, it's very motivating. So as we sit here in 2019, the immunotherapy thing seems like it has an infinite amount of momentum. We, of course, know that that's not true with anything in the world. but what is your general outlook on the field of hematology oncology? Biggest,
Well, I think it's very, very exciting. I love what I do because, especially about the year 2000, when the science we'd always had finally kicked in more and more from bench to bedside, you take some of these novel ideas and bang, they're now applicable. Like taking the breaks, I think of the immuno-oncology as whichever drug you name takes the brakes off of your army. And your army says, hey, there's a non-self invader here called cancer, and I'm going to go attack it. Of course, then the art of practicing taking care of patients on these drugs is, well, there can be some off-target effects called itis, whether it's pneumonitis, carditis, rash, diarrhea, liveritis, hepatitis numbers. And so you have to watch for that. Fortunately, the antidote of steroid almost always works, and these therapies can work very well. I was thinking President Carter and melanoma in the brain went away on one of these drugs. Just amazing time, and we're still learning how to use them. They aren't 100%; they're more like 25 to 35%. But when they work wonderfully. And I think that the novel CAR T therapy, which is another way of waking up your army against your invader, the kind of the next level of care above the antibodies, has some toxic side effects. It's in its infancy. People that would die of lymphoma now are having 25 to 50% complete response rates on those who are eligible.
Crazy.
That's amazing. And so I just am loving this and being able to offer this to patients. Our supportive care, which has kind of been one of my loves and clinical research efforts over these years, taking care of bone metabolism, bone metastases, preventing so-called SREs, skeletal-related events. And then the whole thing about the CBC is your white count or red count or platelet count too low, and we have either growth factors that can stimulate them or ways to unlock a locked up bone marrow that can't seem to make red cells well enough, finding ways to release the block, things like myelodysplasia, Louis-Patercept, plenary session paper at ASH looks to be a novel mechanism that will fill in where the ESAs seem to not be able to fill in many cases. So this kind of stuff, bench to bedside, applicable, useful, right in the clinic now, is very interesting. In fact, on our webpage, and we'll do a podcast about it, our webpage, MDedge Oncology, we have a review going up. I guess today's last day of the month, but it'll be in February, on drugs released by the FDA in oncology in 2018. And there's a lot. And we distill them down by the drug name, brand, generic, disease, where it works, dose, side effect, and whatever the licensing study was, to give the reviewer, the reader, a quick view on how and where to use this new drug.
The tools like that just seem completely irreplaceable, and it's almost, we feel very lucky to be alive when we are, so that things like that exist, and that people have the tools to find the answers to things that they didn't even know the questions to ask. The fact that exists and you can look up things just that happened in 2018 is amazing to me, and it's one of the reasons I love doing what I do, to share information in a digestible way. There's nothing like it.
Yeah, boy, that is so true. You know, no textbook, no notebook. You simply, and I do this with patients, if I'm not sure how often to do the CAT scan surveillance, I pick up the NCCN guidelines and we can look at it together. Or up to date, which I think across all specialties, people use this living textbook that's updated all the time. It's a wonderful service. And I know the other specialties besides HEMONC have similar web pages that are living textbooks and update people real time, on the go, in the room with the patient. So it's an amazing time.
So adding on to that, but also switching gears a little, we are now experiencing, we're going to have this huge waterfall of generation after generation who only know life with having this assistant in your hand, your cell phone, and the World Wide Web, where, I mean, I can touch my phone and food shows up at my house, which is really abstract and crazy way to think about it. But with this generation being able to do that and being able to find answers on their phone with the patient in the room, how have you navigated teaching students and fellows and residents, and what have you learned from them?
Well, I think it has great potential and some risk. So the potential is I prescribe a drug and somebody is already on a drug, and oh gosh, that's a big no-no because the drug-drug interaction that causes trouble, and my EMR or my phone tells me right away. And this can happen in all sorts of practice, being sure you discharge the patient with the right medications, being sure your right orders set properly in the hospital, checks on everything you do because it's built in to watch over your shoulder. The risk is you kind of get so used to it, almost the big brother approach, that you kind of, I think I see occasionally young trainees can forget why or how they're doing that and rely too much on the automatics. So I think it's a great potential, but needs care and not to lose sight of that. Remember, you're the guy doing this. You need to know why you're doing it, how you're doing it, and then the system will hopefully be designed to catch you making a mistake, and then everybody wins.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess a good metaphor would be if you rely only on the GPS, you'll forget how to navigate and find your way in a city or on a country road.
Yeah, very true.
So Blood and Cancer is out every Thursday. The first episode, as we publish this, is out now. And looking down the pipeline of the next 5 weeks, 10 weeks, next couple of years with this new endeavor, or I guess relaunched old endeavor, I wanted to ask, what do you want to get into and what do you want to affect people? So if I talk to you 1 year from today, where do you want the show and the product to be with regard to content and with regard to creating a community?
Well, I'd like on a regular basis to have these podcasts up and running and distributed and people aware that they're there and can consume them, so to speak, and work through the various more common, less common cancers, more common, less common treatments, and supportive care. So, and finally, I'm always jealous of people who know statistics. We have a nice series we're about to launch that we did a couple of years ago in the journal format in print, with two talented statisticians, both in Canada, who have wonderful senses of humor and great grasp of statistics that is applicable and practical to what we know and need to know as we evaluate studies. So we were all in fellowship one day and have some ability to be critical of literature, and this will really help to fold in the statistics. So to answer that question, to run the gamut of practical hematology and oncology, folding in what's new and different as we interview these thought leaders throughout the year.
All right. Well, he's Dr. David Henry. He's the host of MDedge Blood and Cancer podcast, which is out on Thursdays. And David, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me on post call.
Thank you, Nick. A pleasure to talk with you. Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, Dave. And that concludes episode 16 of the MDedge Post Call podcast. I'd like to thank Dr. David Henry for joining me. Blood and Cancer comes out every Thursday wherever podcasts are found. You can subscribe today and find the link to do so in the podcast notes. For MDedge, I'm Nick Andrews.